This is Sarah, and I just want to take a moment to speak to you about this week's sponsor, Favor. Favor Inc. is a statewide family led nonprofit 501c3 organization that is committed to empowering families as advocates and partners in improving educational and health outcomes for our children. Favor is the Connecticut state organization of the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. Favor offers a single place for families with children who have medical, mental, emotional, and behavioral health challenges to find information, assistance, and training. To find out more about Favor, please go to favor-ct.org. We are grateful for our opportunity to work with Favor as a sponsor, and now on to the rest of the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caregiver Chronicles. My name is Sarah, and today I have Annie McDonnell with me. She is an acupuncturist, a sound healer, and a grief educator. Today, she's here to talk to us about grief. How are you doing today, Annie?
Good. It's almost Halloween, so it feels like a good time to talk about grief because this is like the one time of year where like images about death are kind of out in the open. So it's a good opening to go deep.
Absolutely. And also, with the holidays coming up and everything like that, I think grief tends to always be worse around the holidays. But
Yeah.
before we get into all that, would you like to introduce yourself further to my audience?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So I'm an acupuncturist and a sound healing practitioner, and acupuncture also includes qigong and some herbal medicine and breath work and a bunch of other things. Um, and then from my own personal experience with grief, I was drawn to get training in some grief counseling because it is such an issue that affects health in so many ways, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. Um, and I think it's an under discussed topic. So I'm very happy that you're opening the floor to this.
Well, thank you so much for that. And can you explain to our my audience and myself also what exactly a grief educator is?
hmm well, they're called different things. Um, I trained with someone called David Kessler, who people may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote The Five Stages of Grieving. Um, and David Kessler was one of her collaborators, and he's kind of continued her tradition. So he calls his program Grief Educator. But it's also, I personally, like on my website, I kind of call myself a grief guide because it sounds a little pretentious maybe to educate someone about their own grief. Um, but what I look at it as, when you lose someone or something very important to you, um, it feels like the earth dropped out underneath your feet and you're in this strange new wilderness and everything feels kind of um, new and confusing. And so, as a grief guide, I've explored the terrain. I have some maybe helpful tips, and I can maybe point out some trail guides or landmarks along the way to help people give people something to hold on to as they find their way through the process. But grief is so individual and personal. Um, but as a grief educator, my goal is to help people understand that it is a really universal experience and there's nothing wrong with them. There's so many different aspects to grief that aren't talked about. So when you personally experience it, it can be very confusing. So sometimes it can help to get a perspective from someone who has a little more understanding about the depth of the field to kind of help people feel less alone.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I know like one aspect of grief that I feel like isn't talked about enough is pre-grief. People
Mm-hmm,
think that's kind of a funny term, or
mm-hmm,
grieving for a person who's here. Can you
mm-hmm.
talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's so common. There's the official name in the grief community is anticipatory grief. Because you like a death or a loss is on the horizon, so you're kind of inching your way to it, anticipating the worst that's to come. But they're really, so you can start before someone dies, you can obviously grieve their loss because humans have I have a dog right next to me. Humans have the gift and the challenge of being able to like imagine into the future, whereas, animals have maybe an easier time with life cycles because they're not constantly projecting, what's going to happen when something's going to happen. So you can really torture yourself by imagining the worst case scenario or how something is going to happen. I know in my own experience, I lost both of my parents within the past couple of years. And as they got older and older, every time I would get a text, I would kind of jump because I didn't know if someone had fallen or there was an emergency hospital visit, or, when you hit a certain age, so many, so many things can go wrong. So if you're in a caretaker role, or even if you're kind of adjacent to caretaking, like I wasn't directly, except for there were a couple of periods where I was directly caretaking for my mom. But otherwise I was kind of adjacent to that, where me and my sister would, call every day to check how things were going, to call their nurses, to coordinate care, to, people don't even realize how, I know the caretaking community realizes, but outside of that role, people have no understanding of how grueling it is, where even if you're not physically present with someone, giving them a sponge bath or feeding them, there's so much that you're worrying about. There's so much that you're constantly checking in and, double checking, like if Medicaid will reimburse something or scheduling this appointment or, so it's the anticipatory grief stage is this whole maelstrom of worry and anxiety and not knowing what's going to happen next, like knowing that you'll lose someone, but not necessarily knowing how. So trying to do everything you can to kind of postpone the inevitable. And I remember my sister and I would have conversations where, what happens if dad dies first? What will we do about mom? What happens if mom goes first? What will we, all the different scenarios that you're playing out. And, we like to think we have the illusion of control. And so we really exhaust ourselves mentally, physically, emotionally, trying to, control the outcomes as much as possible. And then another aspect to the anticipatory stage is there's so many little losses along the way that can be almost as painful or sometimes even more painful than the actual death. If you have a parent or a grandparent or an aunt and uncle with some form of dementia, you're seeing, the slow progression of, oh, they're not able to drive anymore. They're losing so much of their independence. They're losing their memories. They don't remember, like they still remember me, but they don't remember my child, or they're, having conversations set in the past. So, and that, that's like its own kind of devastation when you're, if that progresses to the point where they don't recognize you anymore, you physically have your parent or grandparent in front of you, but you seemingly have lost that connection where they no longer think of themselves as your parent because they're off in a different world of their own. So there are, and then in terms of, for parents with children with health issues, you have the anticipatory grief of, perhaps it's a disease that's maybe degenerative. So, like if you're caring for someone with cystic fibrosis, you're again doing your very best to manage the situation and keep them as healthy as possible for as long as possible, give them a really happy quality of life. But there's this clock ticking that just kind of weighs over your head. So it's a whole level of exhaustion that most people don't understand. And there aren't really good support systems in place to help with that because it can be so open-ended. When someone dies, if you're lucky, you get a couple weeks of phone calls and supportive letters and emails from people. That drops off pretty quickly. But when you're in this limbo of knowing that you're about to lose someone and kind of treading water furiously to keep from drowning, there's really no, unless you have like a really good hospice service who's kind of giving you some extra resources. And for the parenting community, there might be some support networks that parents have set up amongst themselves, but it's sadly lacking.
Yeah. And I have experienced forms of anticipatory grief with my grandmother, more specifically as she was struggling with Alzheimer's.
Mhm.
It was really hard to lose, like you said, the aspects of what made her her, the essence of her,
Mhm.
till she got to the point where she was a body. Um,
Yeah.
I hate saying it because it sounds so cold, but really there was all the things that made her my warm, loving, sweet grandmother. Um, and she was also funny too. She
Mhm.
had the best personality, but all those aspects of her were gone, and she just slept.
Mhm.
She
Yeah.
was just in her body sleeping, and when she was awake, she was angry, and she
Mhm.
was never really an angry woman. She was always a pretty happy woman.
Mhm.
Um, so I can say that there really isn't a lot of support. That was something that my family was going through, that we were grieving, even we knew she was going to pass.
Mhm.
We knew her time was coming. She was on hospice. We were going through the process of losing her 1 month at a time, losing a different
Yeah.
piece. And
Mhm.
it was very heartbreaking. Even as a mother, I can relate somewhat. My son is not dying. I'm very fortunate. He's physically very healthy. However, I had to grieve the, with the autism diagnosis, especially with him being so profound on the spectrum, I had to grieve my hopes and dreams of certain things like him graduating college, getting married, having children.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm also not saying, and I want to be very clear on this, I am not saying people who are on the autism spectrum cannot get married, graduate college, or have children. That can absolutely happen.
Mhm.
In my son's case, however, with his level of just needing such profound support needs,
Mhm.
it's highly unlikely that he will not. And I had to grieve that.
Yeah.
Um, I had to watch.
Yeah.
I've watched my friends' kids thrive and do things, and it's like there's not a single person told me that. I had to realize it on my own that I
Mhm.
was grieving hopes and dreams that I had for my son.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of grief as, I mean, I think there's this misunderstanding that grief just means sadness, but it really is this whole mosaic of pretty much every human emotion because part of it at its core, it's about love and longing and having this profound love that maybe doesn't have the outlet that you want it to have, either like your wishes for your son or being able to be physically and emotionally have your grandmother here rather than as a memory. So it's at its core, it's about love and longing. But when that longing doesn't have a happy resolution like we see everywhere around us on social media and in movies and TV, it really is something that you have to wrestle with on an ongoing basis because all these milestones will come up where you're grieving now, and then as your child gets older, it will you'll have found ways to manage the grief, but there will still be the pain of certain moments where, it's his 18th birthday and it's a little fresh again of how you're watching his peers go to college and not him. But one of the emotions that comes up from that is there's so much guilt involved. As you said, like when your grandmother was at the end of her life, and I know, like, I didn't want to see my parents suffering. So sometimes it can almost be a relief when someone dies, and then you feel guilty that, wait a minute, I shouldn't be feeling relief, or guilt of maybe I didn't do enough, or, and there's so little understanding to the physical process of death that people, and I think the Western medicine community, unfortunately, isn't the best at communicating what's going on necessarily. So I've recently started following, for people who are on Instagram or Facebook, there's a hospice nurse called Hospice Nurse Julie. I think it's like at Hospice Nurse Julie, I think is her handle. And she does these great mini educational videos of what it's like as a hospice nurse, what she sees every day, so that you can start to realize, oh, okay, it's completely natural that people stop eating and drinking in the final week or two before they go, and it's actually not a good thing to try and force someone to eat, or little indicators along the way in terms of like pain management, and it seems like a very mysterious process. So this, for people who maybe want to educate themselves so that they don't have to feel guilty that, like, oh, I didn't push the nurse to feed my mom. It's like maybe that wasn't the time to push, but you're not getting that clear explanation. So I think it's a good thing the more education is available for people so that they can hopefully peel away some of that grief. And the same thing where, the more it becomes okay for parents to talk openly about the pain of wanting something for their child, loving their child completely and unconditionally, but still feeling pangs that their child won't get to experience certain things. I think the more that becomes, more openly talked about, the less like another layer of guilt and shame will be on top of this already painful emotion, because like we're all thinking these things, but we're afraid to say it. So I'm really glad that you're opening the dialogue, because hopefully even just talking about it or hearing people talk about it will be kind of like good medicine for people who are beating themselves up about what they're thinking and feeling.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for recognizing that. It's, like I said, it's very complicated. And grief,
Mm-hmm.
Grief is not just someone dies, you're sad, and
Mm-hmm.
you get over it. It's so much more complex than that.
Yeah.
And you could lose your house in a fire and grieve your home.
Mm-hmm.
There's different things that we can grieve in our world.
Mm-hmm.
We can grieve losing a job. It's
Yeah.
it's a common it's just such a common emotion. We don't put a
Yeah.
label on it, but there's so many other emotions involved in
Mm-hmm.
grief, in stages of grief. And
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the stages of a traditional grief, like grieving a
Mm-hmm.
death versus like anticipatory grief.
Uh-huh. Well, there's, as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I think her book came out in maybe the late 60s, early 70s. And she was one of the first people to really kind of study grief and talk about it. But the misconception, so she was she popularized the idea of 5 stages of grief. But unfortunately, that's kind of been twisted and misunderstood, because actually, what she was studying people who were dying, not people who had lost someone and were grieving someone post death. So her stages of grief. So and I don't think she ever really put them in order, because it's not a linear process, and you're not doing it wrong if you don't go from step A to step B to step C. They were just kind of like common stages. So anger was one of them, bargaining, denial, um, acceptance was like the final stage, and I'm forgetting what, maybe, I think depression. I think depression was the other one. So, in like the classic misconceived notion was that, like, first you deny, like you deny your diagnosis, or you deny that someone's no longer here, then you get angry about it, then you start bargaining with God or bargaining with the universe, then you get depressed, and then finally you're cured, you've reached acceptance. But it really doesn't work like that. And I think all the modern psychologists who are studying grief now, there are a bunch of different, not stages so much, but a bunch of different, like, milestones and common aspects to it. But basically, it's I'd say it's more of a spiral process than line A to line B. And with, especially with anticipatory grief, there's really no milestones with that, because you are in kind of this limbo where you have, the kind of bad destination, that you're headed on a train speeding towards this loss, but you don't know really what twists and turns will happen along the way. And you could go in anticipatory grief, you could go through similar stages where, first you're denying that someone seems to be losing their memory. Oh, they're just tired, or they're just sleep deprived. So there is kind of a reckoning with that. Okay, this does seem to be heading towards something inevitable. Anger, I think, is very common all along the way. And again, it depends on people's personality too. Some people are more comfortable in sadness. Some people who are very uncomfortable with sadness will often cover that up with anger or lashing out or irritability. And especially, when grief is in a very acute stage, very fresh and raw, that's where it's really unpredictable. And even, people who are, like the sweetest disposition, may lash out, if someone says something really insensitive in a really tender moment. So you never know what someone's going through, especially when you're in the healthcare profession. You get a more intimate glimpse into what people are carrying around every day. So personally, I try and be as kind as possible to everyone who crosses my path. It's hard when someone's being, like really rude or really a jerk. But I do try and keep in mind, like, I don't know what news this person just got, or what they're dealing with or not dealing with, or what they're projecting onto me because they can't express it in a healthier way. And for people who maybe haven't directly experienced much grief, but may want to support friends or extended family members, I'd say, just be really patient, be really kind, drop expectations for someone to, like, text you back, or don't, be careful of what you say. I'd say, it's never a bad thing to say, like, this is, I'm so sad you're going through this. Let me know how I can help, or I'm here to help you, or just keep it very simple, because it's so easy to say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, or to the wrong person, because grief, you're dealing with so many different emotions that, unless someone asks you specifically, oh, can you, how do you deal with this spiritually? Don't volunteer your own, like, everything happens for a reason, or, yeah, I see your reaction. Like, that's one of the worst ones. Um, Part of David Kessler, who I trained with, he added a sixth stage of grief that he likes to emphasize with people. And that stage is finding meaning. Because the acceptance stage, to me, that's really just the beginning. At a certain point, we all have to kind of accept the reality around us that, maybe not someone isn't, there's no medical cure for something, or, you can't bring someone back from the dead. The horrible reality is just horrible. So if you've accepted that, okay, but then what? That doesn't really leave you in a positive place to move forward. So the stage of finding meaning, again, I don't think is something that can be rushed. When grief is really fresh, that's not really the time to kind of bypass the pain and say, oh, it was meant to be, or they're in a better place, or if that helps you to tell yourself that in the moment, that's fine. But the meaning making process is, I think, longer, and you can kind of let it unfold at its own pace. As for me, part of my meaning is that my parents are physically gone, but I know I carry them within me, and there's a way of being in the world that that I can honor them in carrying forth the things that they taught me. So that's one way I found meaning through their loss, is continuing their legacy in an active way. And the same thing with parents, where over the course of parenting your sons, at different stages you will uncover, or come to your own meaning of what it means to be their parent, to help them be be the very happiest they can be, whatever that means for them personally, without measuring against society or other standards. um, so I think the meaning making process is maybe um, part of the way grief continues long term, um, because it will kind of spiral and cycle. People often talk about like waves of grief, and I think that's a good metaphor, because you'll feel like you've reached a good place, and then some anniversary will come along, or some reminder, or even people don't even think necessarily that happy occasions can be really big triggers. Like you said, the holidays coming up, where you really feel the loss of at big family gatherings more than in your day-to-day life, maybe. Or like going to a wedding is a happy occasion, but if you're going to a wedding and your part of you is thinking, oh, I'll never see my son in this situation, then that's, you know it's a shades of emotion experience, where it's not 100% joyful. There is this tinge of sad, or melancholy or sadness. Or maybe you're personally getting married, and you're missing your grandparents or your parents who aren't there. So again, like one strategy to deal with that is to acknowledge it, and not try and like stuff it down. And then once you've acknowledged it, give yourself space to like maybe go off and cry before you then like come back to the happy occasion, and can really feel the happiness because you've kind of acknowledged and released some of the sadness. Or there are also, I think part of what our culture has lost in the modern world is all the rituals and ceremonies that society used to have, especially around death. Um, if you think of like, even I think in the 1800s, a widow might wear black for an entire year, so that you'd go out into the world and people would visibly be able to see, we need to handle her with care because we can see that he's gone through something difficult, and we don't do that anymore. So you can find ways to acknowledge the loss in a kind of ceremonial way. Like I know I've seen at some weddings, people might set a place setting and have a framed photo of someone who is there in spirit, or they may acknowledge them in a speech or a blessing. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, grief is something that you often carry for a lifetime, but you can learn how to carry it in a way that it's not so heavy and constricting and weighing you down.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for all of that information. There was a lot of that really, I know we touched on the holidays.
Hmm.
Excuse me. I know we touched on the holidays a bit, and that's a very difficult time for a lot of families, especially mine. Unexpectedly in 2018, we lost my uncle
Oh,
to a massive heart attack on
oh,
Christmas Day.
oh
And
gosh.
it was Christmas has not been the same since. And
Absolutely.
Christmas was already a little bit tough because it's
Hmm.
Christmas. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. It's already a little
There's
stressful. Yeah.
there's always the argument over the ham is cooked wrong or what,
Right.
there's always
Yeah.
the little things dealing
Hmm.
with the extra family, the expectations of gifts, the financial
Hmm.
obligations to Christmas. It can be kind of a pain in the butt. I always worked Christmas and my husband always worked
Mm.
Christmas, so we had to juggle our schedules. So the whole
Uh,
family tried their best to juggle Christmas dinner and Christmas Day around my husband and my work schedules.
uh,
And it was just the most traumatic thing to have the police. My uncle was with us that morning doing presents. He would dress up as Santa Claus for the
oh,
kids and stuff like that, and they loved it.
yeah.
And he was with us that morning. A couple hours later, we argued with the cops for 10 minutes, as any grieving family would do, because it was like,
Hmm.
again, shock, denial,
Right.
anger,
Yeah.
bargaining. My
Right.
grandmother,
Hmm.
who, yeah, she had dementia, but she understood that something happened to her son.
Oh,
Please don't take my son, take me
yeah.
instead. My husband, I had to hold her and calm her down.
Oh,
It was hard. It was the worst Christmas
yeah.
ever, hands down. Um,
Yeah. Well,
in
I'm so sorry that happened. And on that holiday, and death anniversaries are already painful. And then
Yeah,
when you combine those two, that's like really supercharged. And I think people should realize too that there is like a type of traumatic grief where you can almost have a little like PTSD, where the when you start seeing like the holiday decorations come up, you kind of get a knot in your stomach because there's this association with this shocking traumatic experience. So I think there are people don't necessarily talk much about how physical grief is, and that it's not just like in your head. You feel it in insomnia, you feel it in brain fog and confusion and memory loss and indigestion and loss of appetite or extra appetite, or it's really like extra aches and pains. And there's already a lot of fear involved because it's just kind of natural to be afraid of death, and then the way our society doesn't talk about it, it's even more kind of fear producing. But then if you've seen someone die in front of you, you have that active like muscle memory, and you start wondering, is that going to happen to me when I get older? Or, every like aches and pains, or, when you forget a word, you're like, oh no, is it starting in me? It just like can trigger a cascade where you're like hyper vigilant with yourself, with other family members, with loved ones. And so you're feeling that like your nervous system is always in that fight or flight. Um, and that has like a whole cascade of health effects. So I think it's helpful for people to know that maybe as you're grieving, you should do something physical to kind of like discharge this nervous energy, to maybe work with someone on like if it was particularly traumatic, or like say someone died in a car accident or something, maybe work with someone like on a bodily level to kind of clear some of that muscle memory and tension from your body, so that you're not, so clenched and extra anxious as you're getting different memories popping up. Um,
Yeah.
because ultimately you want to evolve to the point where you'll, you may not be able to erase the memory of someone's final moments, but that's just one piece of it. And you remember more the great love and the times you laughed and the happiness and the way that, oh, now my husband's carrying on the tradition and dressing as Santa, or, um, they, you can, hopefully get to the place where there's more love than fear or anxiety. Um, but it's not helpful to just try and repress that anxiety and say, oh no, I'm not going to think about it. Like you may tell yourself you're not thinking about it, but your body's feeling it. Um, so it's something to just be aware of that. And it's very common too that people will start to kind of feel under the weather or just feel off somehow and not know why, and then realize, oh, next week is the 15th anniversary of when dad died. And you don't necessarily always connect the dots, but like your body knows, especially like if something's linked. I was in New York City during 9/11, and I'm to the point now, like immediately after it happened, every time I saw a plane overhead, I like feel like a physical reaction. I'm way past that point now where it's not like triggering or so traumatic. But even still, like every September, the first day that has like this really blue sky, that was like the similar to the sky on that day, because it was such a contrast, this beautiful crisp fall air and this blue sky, and then the smoke and the wreckage. It's just like, well, it's kind of like burned into my memory. But it's not, I don't feel it in the way that it doesn't like, you know, um, doesn't knock me for a loop anymore. But even so, the first September day, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of this. Um, so I think it is important to acknowledge that too, where like Christmas is always going to be a challenge, and that's okay. But you can look for ways to kind of counterbalance that, and um, honor your uncle's memory, and then move forward. Like, okay, how can we honor him by celebrating?
Absolutely. We actually do a Christmas tree for him every year.
Oh, nice.
They do memorial trees, not far from one of my aunts where she lives. And even though she wasn't that side of the family, after it was my mom's brother who passed. It's my dad's sister who actually
Mm-hmm.
arranged to make sure that we had a tree for him.
Oh,
Even though, because family, your spouse's,
mm,
or
right.
your in-laws usually, or
Yeah.
at least a little bit. So she wanted to make sure, she knew how traumatic that was. She wanted to make sure that we honored him by having this memorial tree for him. And
Oh,
it's we do it for him. We have one for my grandfather. She actually just lost her husband a few months ago, so
mm.
there'll probably be one for him, and we do one for his parents as well. So it's just the whole family gets together and we decorate these trees and we look at
Oh, that's
pictures,
beautiful.
and we have pictures of the family as the family's evolved, even without
Hmm.
the person, because even though the person we're grieving isn't there to see their grandchildren or their grandnieces and nephews, we know, we feel
Hmm.
in our hearts that they would love to see it. And so we
Yeah.
put these trees together, And
Yeah.
it's just a very special day. It's
Hmm.
always a day that we all make sure we're together and we do this on this day. It's a very special and
Uh,
important day for our family.
yeah, that's a beautiful way to make meaning out of that experience. And it was so wise of your aunt to do that too, because one thing that's really common is for people who may want to help someone grieving, they'll they'll often say like, oh, just let me know if you ever need help with anything. And it's an awkward situation, and it's depending like how close you are to the person, and how safe they may feel asking for help. But when you're really grieving, you don't oftentimes have the energy or capacity to even know what it is that you need, or have the energy to reach out and ask for it. Or so if you have like a nice idea like that, and you can just proactively say, or pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm headed to the supermarket, can I pick up some milk and eggs for you and drop them on the porch? Or just like things that you can offer to do. Or I'm walking the dog. Can I walk your dog? Or do you want to come walk with me? And we don't have to talk. We can just walk side by side together. Um, that can be really, really helpful, rather than just saying something generic like, oh, I'm here whenever you need me. If so, your aunt was like super, super smart to do that.
Yeah, she's the best actually. She really is just a sweetheart. And that's a great way to help a family member who's going through grief, like you said.
Hmm.
Can I do this instead of what can I do? Because and I got
Yeah.
to be honest with you, as someone who has grieved,
Hmm.
what can I do? How can I help? That doesn't, I don't know. I
Right.
don't
Right.
know. You don't know
Right.
what you need when you're grieving.
Yeah.
You're so
Right.
entrenched in that wave of whatever emotion it is you're feeling at the time. You don't know. How can I help? I have no idea. I can't
Right.
remember if I peed, showered, or ate today. I'm so upset.
Right.
I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know what's next.
Yeah.
So saying, can I do this for you, is
Yes.
such a
Yeah.
better way to help someone who's coping. Or would you like to talk? I'll just listen.
Yeah.
Or
Absolutely.
just anything
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Or
Um,
even also like because it's such an ongoing I mean, just like that people don't realize, just the paperwork alone, that after someone dies, it can be more than a year where you're still like closing someone's phone account, and sending death certificates here, there, and everywhere, and figuring out, and like you know paying like I was, like it's so weird to be paying taxes for someone who's dead, but like that has to happen too, um, depending like when in the calendar year. It's just like all these details that are like overwhelming with when someone hasn't died, but they're like super overwhelming in the aftermath. So that goes on for many, many months. So it can be helpful to say to someone too, like, I know you must be like so overwhelmed with things right now, and but I want you to know that whether it's 6 months from now or a year from now, if you want me to come over and help you sort through your mom's clothes and pack things up and bring them to Goodwill, or pack them up to send here, there, wherever, just let me know when's good for you, and we'll work it out, and I'll come help you. So again, like something concrete like that is also like an open-ended deadline of like, I know you don't want to like sort through these memories now, but I'm here for you to help, because that's like so overwhelming too, when you literally have to touch every single item that someone has owned. And if you're like me and you're sentimental, you're like, you have to like every time you touch an item, it's like, oh, let me remember this and this and this. And like, how can I possibly give this up? Because it has all these memories attached to it, or like which grandchild should get this, or it's it's like a whole process all on its own. So if you're someone who's like, practically oriented, and is like, just someone organized to say like, let me load up my trunk and I'll take the boxes to Goodwill or to the church or wherever. that can be so helpful too, because it just takes one concrete thing off someone's plate, but doesn't put pressure on them to like, oh, hey, let me come over this weekend. We'll pack up all these things that mean so much to you and that you have to like deal with. Just like give people the space to go at their own their own pace if possible.
Exactly. And even that process can be hard, but there can be some laughter in it too, because a lot of
Oh
times
yeah,
that can definitely trigger some funny. Oh, I remember when she bought this bobblehead,
right,
or whatever
right.
ridiculous, or like we were, me, my mom, my aunt were going through some of my grandmother's jewelry and things like that, and we were doing that, and there was there was just questions over who should have what, or what.
Mm,
My mom didn't know where to put what, who needed this, who
uh-huh.
needed that. She tried her
Right.
best to figure it out. My aunt was there, but shortly after that, my mom said to me, "Oh, I want you and your sister to make a list of the things." Now, mind you, my mom is perfectly healthy. There's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with her.
Uh-huh.
She's doing great. But I want you and your sister to make a list of what you guys want when I pass away, so everybody
Uh,
knows who gets what. And I'm just looking at her and I'm like, I want you to just, so now I
mm.
bust her chops a little bit about that. When I go to her house, I'll point to she got a Grateful Dead tapestry, and I just so happen to be a deadhead also. And I'll take that. Or she has tons of
Right.
seashells and crystals, and I'll take
Yeah.
those.
Right.
And my
Well,
mom's like, the Grateful Dead memorabilia and the crystals, that's all you want. The
but
seashells. And
it's really good to laugh at stuff like that, but it's also like smart of your mom too, because they, again, like you get so swept away in the emotions of grief that you can end up fighting over stupid things.
yeah,
So if it's written down in advance, if people talk about it when like everyone's like when it's not so like emotionally charged, it can make it a lot easier, even if it's, hopefully for your mom, it's like 40 years away, but it
yeah,
won't be an
at
issue
least.
because,
I'm hoping
yeah,
maybe, yeah, I'm hoping at least 40, maybe 50.
yeah, yeah,
She'd kill
but,
me if she
but
heard
at
that at
least,
50.
at, yeah, right. But at least like, you've checked that off the list and you don't have to worry about that in 50 years. So yeah, it's like good. It feels morbid, but it actually is really healthy to know that like that, there are no guarantees, and you do unfortunately lose people too soon. So it's like made me, after losing my parents, like I still don't have a will, and that's on my list. And like I need to get that done because you just never know. We could, be in a car accident or whatever. And why not make things as smooth and easy for people as possible, in, a difficult situation.
Exactly. And I just want to ask you really quick, what is the best, or what do you think the best coping strategy to support, or no, I'm going to say, what do you think the best coping strategy for a person who's grieving is?
Well, it is very individual and it can vary from moment to moment. Um, but I'm actually working on a self-paced digital course right now with different exercises that people can do, because I think a lot of times grief just feels so overwhelming, and it feels like there's not you don't know what to do with it. You don't know what to do with yourself. But there are physical things you can do. There are like simple breathing exercises. There are some simple exercises and like energy exercises that can address different things like insomnia or worry, or just the heaviness of the emotion, that rather than just kind of letting it stick to you, you can use your body and your voice and your breath to kind of let it keep moving through you. So there are a bunch of different techniques like that. I always tell people one of the very best things is to get out into nature. Even if you live in the city, even if you just find like a city tree and just look up at the sky, you just feel like if you look at there's a Qigong exercise. Qigong is like an energy kind of exercise or practice from Chinese medicine. But if you think about a tree is exhaling oxygen and inhaling carbon dioxide, and we're exhaling carbon dioxide and inhaling oxygen. So we're supporting each other. If you picture like the energy of a tree standing there, stuck in place, being rained on, being hit by thunder and lightning, but being a beautiful shelter to birds and giving us life-giving oxygen, and how much, and like how a tree loses its leaves every fall, but then is reborn in the spring. If I find it very helpful to kind of tune into the natural cycles of nature, just kind of like a philosophical way that there's a season for everything, and if you're feeling overwhelmed by emotion, nature can hold that. If you go up and just lean against a tree and just kind of like melt back into it, just like feel it support you. The tree isn't judging you for being sad. It's not judging you for being angry. It's just like, I'm here. I've stood through all these things. I can maybe like give you some ancient wisdom and how to just stay grounded and just kind of like accept what's happening and realize that this can be like when the leaves fall from the trees, they go down into the soil and become nutrients for the next growth cycle. And then like same thing too, if you live by the ocean, if you want to go on just cry it out, just go into the ocean and pound the surf, just let out your emotions because the ocean can handle it. It's hard to find people who won't get uncomfortable seeing you in emotions, but nature can handle everything, and it can kind of take that energy and just recycle it into something useful. There are also, definitely look for someone who is a good listener. If it's good to, maybe you don't want to talk about it endlessly, but part of the processing, it often helps to just kind of get things out of your head and talk to someone who will just listen neutrally without rushing to offer advice or solutions. You can talk. I have, sessions where, I'll offer some perspectives as a grief educator if someone wants them, but otherwise I'll just listen if someone doesn't feel like because part of the thing that's challenging too is when you're grieving a loss, you may have lost the person that you usually go to for primary support. So that's like a huge loss in itself. You're feeling this loss, and then, you usually would go cry to your mom, and then your mom's not there. Who do you go to cry to? Or what also happens is your usual support system is also grieving the same loss. So because everyone's in an acute stage of grief, whereas normally you may have counted on your sister for support, she's dealing with her own grief. Or it's very difficult for married couples with something happening to their child because all this tension can build up if both partners are grieving, but they may be grieving in different ways, or they have different grief styles, and a lot of friction can develop because they're not understanding each other, or they both are in so desperate need of support. Neither one has the emotional resources at that moment to help each other. So that's why it is really helpful to find a grief counselor or a friend who's a little more removed, who can just neutrally listen and be someone to lean on, so that you don't have to, you're not navigating like the tricky emotional aspects of, I don't want to upset mom by crying to her about grandma because she is grieving her mother. It's a challenge. So those are some tips that, I definitely want people to know that when they're grieving, they're absolutely entitled to their grief. They don't have to compare it to anyone else's grief. They don't have to worry that they're not doing it right. And there are various supports, and there are ways to work through it without just kind of like stuffing it down or ignoring it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that advice. And my final question for you, where can my audience find more information?
Sure, my website is joyalchemyhealing.com. They can also, on Instagram, I'm at Acupuncture Annie, and anyone can feel free to reach out to me through email. I'm joyalchemyacupuncture@gmail.com. So if you have other questions or you'd like more grief resources, there's a bunch of great books out there. I have a Spotify playlist of like 2 hours of sad songs. Like if you need a good cry, sometimes music is, if you just feel those tears building up, and sometimes music is a really good way to just let things out. So if anyone wants resources like that, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much for that. And I will link your website and your social media accounts in our show notes for my audience. And with that, I want to thank you so much again, Annie, for being here. I look forward to having you back in a couple weeks. And that will wrap up this week's episode of Caregiver Chronicles. I want to thank you all for listening. If you liked this podcast and you want to show us support, we have a Buy Me a Coffee account that's linked in the show notes. But more importantly, if you could like, share, or and subscribe to our podcast, that's more important. If you have a friend who's grieving or you know someone who could really benefit from this conversation Annie and I had today, please share this episode with them. It helps me and hopefully helps them. And again, I want to thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.